expressed during this program may not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government. A little background, or next slide, please. A little background on today's presenter. Jose Abrentes is the Senior Manager for Global Trade Compliance at OFS Fattel. As such, he is responsible for OFS's global trade compliance program. In this capacity, he oversees the company's 6 U.S. locations and 6 worldwide manufacturing sites. They are located in China, Denmark, Germany, Mexico, Morocco, and Russia. OFS is part of the Furukawa Electric Company, and part of his responsibilities is to build out their global compliance strategy. Jose has implemented an export and import compliance program with emphasis on training and awareness, technology controls, customer screening, record keeping, as well as customer programs such as duty drawback and product classification reviews. Prior to OFS, Jose worked for Perkin Elmer as their global compliance program manager, focusing on export regulations, training and awareness, internal control plans, project management, import-export operations, and SAP or SAP. Jose serves as the current chairman for the Connecticut District Export Council, and he earned his undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University. I will now pass it over to Jose. Jose, sir.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate it. Well, I think this is the time, a year, close to a year from the time that we have gone live with the USMCA, where we can probably have look back and see what are some of the changes, some of the impacts in the industry, understanding that depending on the industry, and like any free trade agreement, there has been winners and losers, and there's been people who have their life a little more complicated because of the USMCA, some that the life has not changed much. It's really the landmark United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, USMCA, went into effect July 1st, 2020. Having been ratified by all 3 nations, the USMCA replaced the former North America Free Trade Agreement, Nafta, which had gone into effect back in 1994. And like the old agreement, really issues a new era of cooperation between these 3 countries. Many have called the USMCA a new Nafta or Nafta 2.0. In a way that's not too far from the truth. The USMCA does modernize much of the NAFTA work set as out to do. There are some differences between the old and the New Deal. We'll go into some of those as well. Just a little bit about NAFTA, about the USMCA and the whole North American market, and why the agreement got such a visibility, not just in the US, but in the world. The real GDP of the USMCA countries, so Mexico, US, and Canada, in 2020 was equal to $24.2 trillion. That's 30% of the global GDP in 3 countries alone. That's larger GDP than Europe or China. So the power of an agreement that including these 3 economies, it is substantial. NAFTA brought about significant effects in terms of trade. This whole establishing the North America production chains, supply chains with interesting effects, on both locations, and in particular on the US-Mexico border, and even within the Mexico in itself. There have been economic effects of USMCA are going to be limited as far as with major effects really related to trade liberalization at the initial stages. And we we can identify clearly which sectors were the most impacted on. We're talking about dairy, steel and aluminum, textiles, apparel, and automobiles. Those were the industries that really got the most impact changes. But for the most part, others were not as impacted, really. USMCA is likely to affect overland transport and logistics modes, in a particular road and rail in the coming years. We'll try to have some time towards the end for question and answers. We also available at any time after the presentation. If you have a question, just send out an email at your, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Now, there's some things that are very unique to USMCA, and looking at this timeline on the next steps, they're still in July 1st, 2020 was day one when the agreement went in place. It will take 3 years to allow countries to fully adhere to the trade policies in that agreement, and we'll touch a little base about that. But a lot of the things as far as work requirements, salaries for employees, some certain conditions that need to be met, in particular in Mexico. Governments of the 3 countries have 3 years to enforce in full the USMCA stipulations. So we're still in that first year. Some of those changes definitely have not gone through. Now, the interesting thing about the USMCA that was not in the Nafta, and part of the criticism of the Nafta, it was an old trade agreement that did not fit the modern day needs for the US and for the industry, is that the USMCA has a sunset clause. It includes a 16-year expiration date and requires by 2026 to the first review or the first revision the USMCA with the possibility of extending that sunset clause. So there's a 16-year expiration date of the USMCA, and there is a revision that is expected by 2026. Maybe there are certain trends that need to be addressed, some inequalities that have come up, some new issues that need to be addressed. That gives the opportunity to make it more of a living agreement where it is more adapted. Things can change on the USMCA that were not. So really looking at the US NAFTA versus USMCA, NAFTA is now gone, is past us. Looking at some of the biggest differences at a glance, really talking about building labor protections in Mexico. And again, Mexico has 3 years to do this. Labor was and remains cheaper in Mexico than in the US or Canada. However, the USMCA levels the playing field with additional protections for workers in Mexico. And now there is going to be penalties for violation of labor laws with cancellation of shipments. Products of forced labor are barred from importation, and workers can organize and bargain collectively. So those are key aspects that, well, some people are saying, well, that is going to raise up some of the salaries in Mexico and maybe hurt the overall supply chain. But we're really talking about leveling the playing field between these 3 countries and raising the economic development in Mexico. Reducing protections for drug companies. We'll cover them more up front too, but under NAFTA, drug companies enjoy protections for lucrative subdivisions of the pharmaceutical industry. These protections have been removed, but it's lost supposedly balanced with gains elsewhere. So a 10-year protection against generic biologics has been removed, and copyrights are now 70 years, up from 50 under the previous NAFTA. So there's some of the protections that have been taken care of. Increasing protections for technology firms. Technology and data companies now enjoy increased protections related to intellectual property and privacy concerns. Governments can no longer request source code from tech companies, and duties on electronic transmissions are prohibited. So that is something that was put in place. Incentivizing North American manufacturing. The USMCA increases NAFTA's increases the previous NAFTA's efforts to keep producing in North America rather than compelling nations in Europe and Asia, and rather than in competing nations in Europe and Asia. Due to this, now the U.S. PACS has the push for U.S. business owners to invest in industrial buildings in Mexico for their companies. This aspect of the trade agreement works to open up more markets access to the three countries involved in the new trade deal. For example, to qualify for zero tariff, automakers must produce 75% of a vehicle now the content in North America, up from 62.5% that had been required under Nafta. So utilize high wage factories, now minimum $16 per hour average salary for at least 40 to 45% of the parts of a vehicle. And ensure that 70% of the steel and aluminum used in the new vehicle must be melted and poured within North America. Now, this is a higher standard, and if you are in the automotive industry, you definitely have become aware very quickly of these requirements and how they're going to impact your production and your USMCA. And then the other thing was dismantling the arbitration system, which was controversial, was one of the biggest issues that people had with the USMCA, enable companies to sue governments over the right to conduct business in a given country. No such mechanism now exists between the US and Canada, and specifications for Mexico and US cases have been drastically restricted. So the whole arbitration system has been kind of changed how you used to operate. So updating NAFTA to bring it to the 21st century, really, whether, again, and I understand that for some companies, really, there's really no effect. Very few things are different. Others are significant. We talked about the automotive industry. Now, the agriculture also changed. We phased out agriculture tariffs with Mexico and most with Canada, excluding those on dairy, poultry, eggs, and sugar on NAFTA. Now it enhances access to Canada for US dairy, poultry, and eggs and egg products. There are still some restrictions, but those are the ones, the dairy industry that you probably did hear a lot as we're talking about the USMCA. Now that market is more accessible for the US. On the small business, really, there was nothing there. Established a committee on small businesses issues to help firms expand trade internationally, not just within the USMCA countries, but that small business is there, and something that the export services definitely do as well. A lot of work in supporting the small business issues community. Labor provisions, we talked a little bit about this, about by 2023, 40 to 45% automobile parts must be made by workers who earn at least $16 per hour. That is not necessarily the reality today. It must be under the agreement by 2023. Digital trade prohibits custom duties on electronically distributed products, software, video games, movies, music, books, and supports really the cross-border flow of data between the three countries. You know, as you see, opposite to some barriers that have been lifted in other countries for the trade of software, electronic movement of data. We talked about the biopharmaceuticals as well. There are some protections that come to that. On the copyrights, protects creative works, music, movies, and books for 70 years after a creator's death. So that's something to keep in mind, not from the time the work was created itself, but the creator's death. E-commerce increases the threshold at which U.S. shipments to Canada and Mexico incur duties at $112 and $117 respectively on the e-commerce sales. And then the environment really eliminates the legal mechanism companies use to combat environmental regulations. Again, there are winners and losers in the USMCA. If you are one of the people that have been impacted and you feel like it's negative, you probably feel like that was a bad deal for you. Overall, I think that the auto industry, the requirements have been more aggressive, that focus on the American production, automotive, and non-American companies that they have now a bigger requirement that they have to fill in order to be able to qualify in the USMCA. No longer one company can move all their parts into Mexico and just do an assembly line. So moving Mexico from an assembly area to really a manufacturing point of it. Dairy and agriculture industry, we talked a little about that. The small business, the labor provisions, digital trade, biopharmaceutical, copyright, e-commerce, and environment. Those are the ones we were talking about before. So what has changed beyond that on the practical day-to-day? If you are qualifying your product for USMCA, there has a change. Well, it has if you are an automotive company, and now you have to prove beyond, you have to prove the salary for your employees. Not only you have to prove just the where the products are manufactured. And something I wanted to distinguish here. I don't know the level of expertise of everyone attending, so I always like to say this. There's a country of origin certificate and there's a USMCA certificate, and those are two different things when you're doing business. A certificate of origin, you're really saying, I made this at my shop, in this case here in Connecticut, or the supplier that I bought it from certified that they make it at their shop. Typically, a substantial transformation is sufficient for you to provide like a certificate of origin. So I made it here, I can give you a certificate of origin. Now, certificate of origin is different than a USMCA certificate. Now, under the USMCA certificate, you are stating that you have reviewed the USMCA rules for your specific commodity and your product, commodity your product is under, and your product qualifies for preferential treatment under the free trade agreement, in this particular USMCA. So you are saying a lot. And we are not necessarily going over all the calculations. There are other webinars that we have covered in the past over that, and they are available, I believe, online for your viewing if you want to really go down to how to make the calculations. But be aware of the difference between just saying, oh, just because I made my product in Connecticut or in the US, that I can sell it to Mexico or Canada and automatically apply for USMCA. That is not necessarily the case. You really are, a lot of times a Canadian customer or Mexican customer will ask you for for a certificate of origin. And if they're in Canada or Mexico, you got to really make sure what they're going to do with it. If they're going to claim for preferential treatment, they probably want a USMCA certificate and not just a country of origin certificate. So a little bit on the certificate. It's one, again, if you're not on the automotive and some of those major impacted areas, we are talking about the USMCA does not require a certificate like the Nafta certificate that everybody knows. There is no required certificate of origin for USMCA. So the form 434 that many of you have used for years is no longer in use. You do have to go through qualification process, like we talked. You know, either the goods are wholly obtained or produced in one of the countries. The goods are produced exclusively from domestic materials, or each material incorporated into that good undergoes an applicable change in tariff classification, a substantial transformation. And that could be a combination of both. You may need to have a substantial transformation and have 65% of qualifying content, US, Mexico, or Canada. So you may have to have both of them, okay? There are data elements that are set out in USMCA Annex 5A, and really that's what constitutes the new certification of origin. You must indicate that the goods claiming preferential origin meets the requirements of USMCA. This information may be provided on your commercial invoice, or you can just create your own standalone document. You can call it USMCA certificate or whatever you want to call it, but you can create your own, or if you have room, you can put it on your commercial invoice. The information must describe the originating goods in sufficient detail to enable its identification and meet the requirements set out on the regulations. And I know it's a little smaller here, but you'll have to indicate all those requirements, whether you put all that information in your certificate of origin, in USMCA certificate, or you put it on your commercial invoice. If you have all those elements in the commercial invoice, you don't need to supplement the information. I did have a shipment stuck in customs because I created this beautiful USMCA certificate, sent it to Canada. Got stuck in Canada because there is no such thing as a USMCA in Canada. Be aware that USMCA, it's what it's called in the US. In Canada is officially known as Canadian United States Mexico Agreement, so CUSMA in English. And in Mexico, it's called T-MEC, so Tratado entre México, Estados Unidos y Canadá. So T-MEC, so you either, if you create your own USMCA certificate, you either add all three of them at the top. Otherwise, don't just call it USMCA. It doesn't seem like Canadian or Mexican authorities like it because they have their own name for it. Okay, so again, I'm really repeating a little bit. A certificate of origin is not required for non-commercial importation of a good or a commercial importation for which the value of the originating goods does not exceed $2,500. And this is also something new in the agreement. Provided an importation does not form part of a series of importations that may be considered to have undertaken or arranged for the purposes of evading U.S. law. So you can't, you have something that's worth $15,000, you break it down into shipments of $2,500 just so you don't have to declare the originating goods and provide the right information. So you cannot do that. But if you have a shipment under $2,500, you do not require to provide origin certification for the goods. And then note that even if the value of non-originating goods is less than $2,500, a written statement certifying that the goods originate, where the goods originate, may still be required. somewhere. But you don't have to go through the USMCA qualification process for shipments that are under $2,500 or non-commercial importation of goods, parcels between individuals and persons or something like that. That was what we had as far as all the information. I figured that there may be some time for questions for us to go over. And I know I went through all just a refresher what the USMCA was about. I figured if there are questions, we can take it from here.
Thank you, Jose. And